What's happening around the Detroit Lions right now creates a very specific kind of tension because at the center of it all is Dan Campbell. And today, that tension comes from two very different directions at the same time. On one hand, there's a very real critique being voiced publicly by one of the most respected defensive players in the NFL. On the other, there's a major national endorsement that reinforces just how transformative Campbell's tenure in Detroit has been. When you put those two things together, you start to see a much deeper conversation forming about where the Lions are, how they operate, and what choices may define the next phase of this era. The critical side of this story begins with comments made on the St. Brown Brothers podcast, where Amon-Ra St. Brown and his brother hosted San Francisco 49ers linebacker Fred Warner. The conversation drifted toward injuries, a topic that hits close to home for both franchises. The 49ers have been ravaged by injuries in recent seasons, and Warner himself was lost for the year. When Amon-Ra mentioned that the Lions have also dealt with heavy injury totals year after year, Warner jumped in with an observation that immediately caught attention. He pointed directly at the Lions training camp practices under Dan Campbell, specifically the level of physicality and the fact that Detroit goes fully live, including tackling to the ground. Warner explained that in San Francisco, they do not conduct full contact tackling sessions in training camp. He contrasted that with Detroit's approach, which Amon-Ra confirmed by saying that new players often arrive and are shocked by how intense Lions practices are because that level of physicality is constant. Warner didn't dismiss the mindset behind Campbell's philosophy. He acknowledged that Campbell clearly believes players must practice tackling in order to tackle well. But Warner also argued that there is a line where the added risk outweighs the benefit. From his perspective, tackling technique can be drilled without taking players all the way to the ground. And once desperation kicks in, both the tackler and the ball carrier are put at unnecessary risk. The implication was clear, even if it was never stated outright. Warner believes the Lions' injury problems, particularly on defense, may be connected to how physically demanding their training camps are. That suggestion carries weight because it comes from an 8-tier NFL veteran who has played at an elite level and understands how teams manage workload over long seasons. This was not Amon-Ra criticizing his coach, and it was not a teammate airing grievances. It was an outside voice offering an experienced opinion, and that distinction matters. At the same time, it's impossible to ignore the context of the Lions' recent injury history. This season alone, multiple key players missed extended stretches, including Sam Laporta, Brian Branch, Joseph Mahogany, DJ Reader, Terrion Arnold, Alim McNeil, and Marcus Davenport. The volume is hard to dismiss, and it naturally raises questions. Yet there is also another side to that discussion. Not every injured player went through a full Lions training camp. Some arrived mid-season or were already managing physical issues. The organization also did not make changes to the athletic training staff, which suggests the team does not believe the root problem lies there. If adjustments come, they would likely come from Campbell himself, possibly dialing back certain elements without abandoning the identity he has built. That identity, for better or worse, is a major reason the Lions are even in this position to be scrutinized so closely. And that leads directly into the other piece of Dan Campbell news that dropped the same day, which could not be more different in tone. ESPN's Bill Barnwell released an evaluation of NFL head coaching hires over the last 5 years, covering the 2021 through 2025 offseason cycles. Out of 37 head coaches hired during that span, Barnwell ranked Dan Campbell as the #1 hire in the entire league. This ranking becomes even more striking when you consider the competition. Nick Sirianni, who has won a Super Bowl with Philadelphia, came in second. Ben Johnson, now a head coach himself, was 9th. Liam Cohen ranked 11th. Campbell's overall winning percentage during that span ranked 7th, yet Barnwell still placed him at the top because of context. When Campbell arrived in Detroit, he inherited a roster and culture left behind by the Matt Patricia era, a team that had gone years without a playoff win and was coming off a complete organizational collapse. What followed was not a quick fix or a fluke season, but a sustained rebuild. Under Campbell, the Lions produced 4 straight winning seasons. Even a year widely labeled as disappointing still ended at 9-8. The team won multiple playoff games in a single postseason and reached the NFC Championship game. More importantly, Detroit became a destination. Free agents wanted to be here. Players embraced development. The locker room identity became real, not manufactured. Barnwell's assessment reflects the idea that Campbell didn't just win games. He changed the trajectory of a franchise that had been stuck for decades. This is where the story becomes especially compelling for Lions fans. The same coach, being subtly criticized for his extreme physical standards, is also being recognized as the best coaching hire in the NFL over a 5-year span. Those two things are not separate conversations. They are connected. The toughness, accountability, and intensity that define Campbell's Lions are the same traits that helped rebuild this team from the ground up. The question is not whether that approach works, because the results clearly show that it has. The question is whether it needs to evolve to protect the long-term health of a roster now built to contend every year. That balance is not easy. Campbell has never shied away from transparency, and he has never pretended his methods are for everyone. But the Lions are no longer hunting respect. They have it. They are no longer trying to prove they belong. They do. The next challenge is sustainability. How does Detroit maintain its edge without crossing into unnecessary risk? How does this team stay physical while keeping its best players on the field deep into January? This conversation isn't about tearing down Dan Campbell. It's about understanding that success brings new questions, and great coaches are often defined by how they adjust once they reach this stage. With national praise on one side and credible critique on the other, the Lions are standing at an important crossroads that could quietly shape the next few seasons. What do you think? Lions fans, should Dan Campbell stick fully to the physical identity that rebuilt this franchise? Or is it time to slightly adapt that approach now that Detroit is a consistent contender? When you zoom out and look at everything surrounding the Lions right now, it becomes clear that this discussion about Dan Campbell is really a reflection of where the franchise has arrived. Detroit is no longer operating in survival mode. This team is no longer trying to shock the league or catch opponents off guard with raw emotion and effort. The Lions are now a program with expectations, and that changes how every decision is evaluated, especially when it comes to leadership, health, and long-term vision. One of the most important elements to remember is that Dan Campbell has never coached from a place of ego. His entire approach since arriving in Detroit has been rooted in honesty, accountability, and self-evaluation. He has openly admitted mistakes in the past, whether they involved game management, staff decisions, or roster handling. That history matters because it suggests that if Campbell believes something needs to be adjusted, he will not resist simply to protect an image. The physical nature of Lions training camp has always been intentional, designed to harden a roster that once folded under pressure. That mission has largely been accomplished. The Lions today are mentally tough. They don't flinch in close games. They don't crumble after losses. They don't shy away from physical opponents. Those traits are now embedded in the culture, and culture, once established, does not disappear overnight if practices change slightly. That is why the Fred Warner comments land differently now than they might have a few years ago. Early in the rebuild, that level of intensity may have been necessary to reset standards. Now, the roster is filled with veterans and leaders who already understand what is required. It is also worth noting how players inside the building respond to Campbell. Even in the podcast conversation that sparked this debate, Amon-Ra St. Brown never criticized his head coach. He simply acknowledged the reality of how the Lions practice. That distinction is crucial. There is a difference between players complaining and players explaining. Throughout Campbell's tenure, there has been no indication of a fractured locker room or resentment toward the coaching staff. In fact, quite the opposite. Players routinely defend the program, embrace the grind, and speak openly about how much belief there is in the building. At the same time, availability matters. The Lions have seen promising stretches disrupted by injuries at key moments, particularly on defense. When you lose players like Alan McNeil, Brian Branch, or Marcus Davenport for extended periods, it forces younger or less experienced players into roles they may not yet be ready to handle. Over a long season, those losses compound. Even a well-built roster feels thinner when depth is constantly being tested. That reality is impossible to ignore when evaluating how the Lions can take the next step from contender to true championship threat. This is where Campbell's national recognition becomes part of the equation. Being ranked as the best head coaching hire of the last 5 years is not just about wins and losses. It reflects trust in his leadership, his ability to build culture, and his adaptability. Barnwell's evaluation highlights that Campbell succeeded under circumstances that would have broken many coaches. He inherited a roster with little talent, minimal confidence, and a fan base exhausted by disappointment. He didn't just improve the team, he redefined it. That credibility gives Campbell flexibility. Coaches without that resume often feel trapped, fearing that any deviation from their identity could undermine their authority. Campbell does not face that problem. His voice carries weight. His players believe in him. His front office trusts him. That combination creates space to evolve without losing control of the locker room. Adjusting training camp intensity does not mean abandoning toughness. It means recognizing that the Lions are no longer building a foundation, they are protecting one. There is also the broader league context to consider. Teams that sustain success over long periods often find ways to manage physical wear without losing their edge. Smart load management, situational contact, and targeted physical reps have become more common as seasons grow longer and playoff paths become more demanding. The the Lions entering this conversation is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that they are now operating in the same space as the league's most stable franchises. Ultimately, this moment feels less like a crisis and more like a checkpoint. Dan Campbell has already cemented his place as one of the most important figures in modern Lions history. That doesn't mean his job is finished, it means the job has changed. The goal is no longer to prove Detroit belongs, the goal is to keep Detroit at the top year after year while giving this roster the best possible chance to stay healthy and peak at the right time. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe the Lions should make subtle changes to how they practice in order to protect players? Or do you think the physical approach should remain untouched because it defines who this team is? What makes this situation even more fascinating is how it exposes the fine line between identity and evolution. For years, Lions fans begged for a team that would punch back, a team that wouldn't be pushed around physically or mentally. Dan Campbell delivered that, and he did it in a way that felt authentic, not forced. Practices became harder because standards were higher. Accountability became real because excuses were no longer tolerated. That didn't just change Sundays, it changed how players approached the entire job. But once a standard is established, the challenge shifts from building it to preserving it. The Lions are no longer trying to convince players to buy in, they already have buy-in. Leaders like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jared Goff, Penei Sewell, Frank Ragnow, and Alex Anzalone don't need to be pushed into understanding what it means to be a Lion. They live it. That's why the next step for this team may not be about intensity, but about precision, knowing when to push, knowing when to pull back, knowing that toughness isn't just about collision, but about availability in December and January. There's also a strategic layer to this that often gets overlooked. As the Lions continue to draft later and later each year, depth becomes more important than ever. You can't rely on elite draft position to patch holes quickly. Injuries hit harder when you're picking in the back half of the first round and competing with other contenders for free agents. Every rep lost to injury is magnified when expectations are championship level. That reality forces coaching staffs to think differently, not emotionally, but mathematically. Another important angle is how the rest of the league is now watching Detroit. The Lions are no longer a feel-good story. They are a measuring stick. Opposing teams study how Detroit practices, how they prepare, how they develop players. When respected veterans like Fred Warner make comments like these, it sparks league-wide discussion. Not because the Lions are doing something reckless, but because they're doing something intense enough to be worth debating. That alone shows how far the franchise has come. And none of this erases what Dan Campbell has already accomplished. His ranking as the best head coaching hire of the last 5 years isn't about popularity or personality, it's about results layered over context. He didn't inherit stability, he created it. He didn't step into a playoff roster, he built one. That gives him a rare kind of authority, the kind that allows a coach to adjust without being questioned internally. If changes happen, they won't be because of outside noise. They'll be because Campbell and his staff decide it's the smartest path forward. This offseason feels pivotal, not because something is broken,